Are you ready to take on the future of cyber resilience? On November the 19th, Commvault's Shift Virtual brings you dynamic keynotes, breakthrough product innovation, and live Q&A with the experts. It's your chance to stay ahead of the threats shaping tomorrow. You'll join global leaders and innovators with live captions in more than 15 languages wherever you are. Don't just keep up, lead. Register now for Commvault's Shift Virtual.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Global Tech Tales, where we hear stories from IT leaders and editors from around the world about the latest technology and leadership topics. I'm Keith Shaw, co-hosting along with Matt Egan. He is the Global Content and Editorial Director at Foundry, and he also represents the UK in this case. Hello, Matt. Welcome back.
Hey, Keith. How you doing?
Good. So today we are going to talk about some of the latest trends in cybersecurity, specifically how attackers are going after edge devices and other infrastructure systems that lie in a remote setting. While other endpoint devices such as laptops and employee workstations are still vulnerable, researchers have seen a surge in the types of attacks that are going after enterprise edge devices. So as always, we start with some statistics and surveys that were out there. Got some cool stats here to talk about with you, Matt. First of all, Google's threat intelligence group tracked 75 in the wild 0 days in 2024, and 44% of those attacks targeted enterprise technologies, not end-user platforms. A large share of those hit security and networking appliances such as VPNs, firewalls, and routers. And in fact, the 2025 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, sometimes known as the DBIR, notes that the edge devices and VPNs accounted for 22% of exploitation of vuln actions, up almost eight times from last year. So that's a huge surge. And remediation was incomplete for nearly half of those. It took about 32 days for most of those vulnerabilities to be patched. And finally, recorded future observed edge gateway appliances among the top exploited classes, with more than 50% of attributed exploitation by state actors. And we're even seeing this in the news. Recently, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, urged government agencies to address 2 Cisco security vulnerabilities, warning that state-sponsored threat actors are actively exploiting these flaws. So, what are some of your thoughts around these statistics and news items that are coming up, Matt?
I mean, it's so striking, right? We are used to now, like the threat coming in through the front door, right? The issue being like phishing, human beings like making mistakes, letting folks into end user devices, and yet this is a really striking surge, right? Where sometimes vulnerabilities that have been known about and understood for decades are acted on, or these 0 days, which are the real issue, right? Because that's immediately a problem without a solution. The reason this happens is only ever because it's the most effective way for the bad guys to get in. But why is it happening? Right? I'm really interested to understand why it is that they would now be choosing to go for these vulnerabilities in these sort of central edge devices, rather than what we've become used to, the sort of front door attack.
Yeah, and so I think to bring up the issue, we're going to bring in our senior expert on all things cybersecurity. We're going to throw it over to Lucian Constantine. He is from CSO, and he's going to discuss the issue with Daniel Dos Santos, a security research at Forescout Technologies. So take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Global Tech Tales, where we speak with IT leaders about the latest technology trends. My name is Lucian Constantin. I'm a senior writer with CSOonline.com. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Dos Santos, Senior Director and Head of Research at Forescout Technologies, a company that specializes in cyber risk management, amongst other things. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me, Lucian.
Of course. So, Daniel, you have extensive experience in vulnerability research and intelligence, particularly in areas like network security, enterprise IoT, industrial control systems, and what we broadly call embedded devices. And one topic I wanted to discuss with you today is, over the past several years, but more so over the past 2 years, last year and this year, we've seen a sharp rise in attacks exploiting both known and previously unknown 0-day vulnerabilities across a range of enterprise network edge devices. These include VPN gateways, firewalls, load balancers, email and web security gateways, routers, switches, and so on. And many of these attacks, especially those leveraging zero-day vulnerabilities, have been attributed to cyber espionage groups operated by or affiliated with nation states. At the same time, ransomware operators and other financially motivated groups have also been quick to exploit these flaws for initial access into corporate environments, often only a few days after the vulnerabilities received a patch. So, why are we seeing this surge in attacks against network edge devices now? Vulnerabilities in these systems are not a particularly new development, right? The researchers have been reporting them for over a decade, yet attackers seemed less interested in targeting them in the past.
Yeah, so there are several reasons for that. Let me go into some detail. So one of the things is that there has been a shift in general into exploiting vulnerabilities rather than using credentials, leaking credentials, phishing, and all these kinds of attacks that don't rely on vulnerabilities themselves, right? It's not that those attacks don't happen anymore. They still happen. Phishing is very relevant, credential leaks and all that. But we do see an increase in vulnerability exploitation in general, and particularly in the types of devices that you mentioned, network edge devices and so on. One of the main reasons is their privileged position in the network, right? The fact that once you have a access into a router, a VPN appliance, and so on, you usually get a very privileged position in the network. You can see a lot of the traffic. You can connect, move laterally to other parts of the system. It's not like getting access to a workstation that might not have, what you're looking for as an attacker. Another reason is actually the lack of telemetry, security telemetry of those devices, which makes security response and kind of understanding those attacks, responding to those attacks much harder. So it's true that vulnerabilities have existed for a very long time on those devices, but threat actors have kind of caught up to the fact that it's easier to achieve massive scales of attacks when you're looking into those devices than with other types of attacks, right? And we do see, for instance, that you mentioned nation states, often for espionage, for pre-positioning into specific networks. We do see ransomware groups specifically very, very active into routers and network edge devices. We did have a couple of blogs where we talked about even them using 0 days as well, which is something that ransomware groups have been using in the past couple of years. But we also see more attacks coming from automated sources like botnets and scanners online and so on. So as a whole, these devices have been massively scanned and exploited in the past couple of years, as you mentioned. Everything that is online and that has an unpatched vulnerability and that has this privileged position in the network has been targeted.
Okay. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic and the rapid shift that followed to support a fully remote workforce and later a hybrid one that we have today led to an increase in the number of deployed network edge devices such as VPN gateways, firewalls, and traffic monitoring appliances? In other words, is this also a case of there now being more devices in this space for attackers to target than maybe in the past? So we are seeing more attacks as well.
Yeah, that is one of the factors as well. The fact that there's way more VPN connections as a whole, and after the pandemic, yes, but in general, VPNs have been growing recently. There are also other factors, other types of devices. As the world becomes more connected, becomes more digitalized, let's say, right? A lot of OT networks that used to be very air-gapped or segmented and so on have also also for the need of remote access, remote management, have been connected to the internet via industrial routers, via VPN appliances, secure remote access solutions, and so on. And those are also exposed online and have been targeted by threat actors as well. So indeed, the pandemic kind of accelerated, but it's a trend that was going on and will continue to go on even after the pandemic now, right? The need for more connection into different environments for remote monitoring, remote management, remote access into a lot of environments. And yes, work from home is one of those cases, but also, as I said, industrial, medical environments and several others are becoming more connected.
Okay. And do you think because for many years, phishing and social engineering. So attackers, as a form of initial access, attackers were focusing on getting malware implants onto endpoint devices, employee workstations, laptops, so on, and then performing lateral movement across the network, targeting servers, domain controllers, that sort of things. Whereas the security industry has focused a lot on securing the endpoint, right? And also security awareness training for employees. And do you think we're at a point where the endpoint is now more secure and attackers are kind of looking for the new low-hanging fruit, which at the moment appears to be these network edge devices?
I do think so. There are a couple of issues there. So first, yes, we still see, as I said in the beginning, phishing. We still see the credential leaks and so on. But those tend to happen now in workstations that are less secure, or that are not running EDR, or on personal laptops and things like that. And it's more to deploy info stealers in many cases, or rats and this kind of attack, which is different from the targeted attack that we're talking about here. It's different from the massive ransomware deployments and so on. Those more sophisticated attacks are many times now either starting from unmanaged devices, as we call them, as the network edge, or at some point moving laterally to those devices. So there are lots of examples, and those are connected to EDR advancements and basically the fact that workstations and traditional endpoints are more secure, right? So we've been talking here about the initial access on the edge devices. That's one case. But we also see, for instance, ransomware being deployed on virtualization servers, right? ESXi servers. We also see examples of ransomware groups that have, for instance, moved laterally to IP cameras to then encrypt files on a workstation starting from the IP camera, because the EDR was blocking the ransomware from executing on the workstation. So there is a strong correlation between advances in EDR and being able to detect and respond to more of those attacks and more sophisticated attacks, let's say, and threat actors moving to devices that are unmanaged, that have less telemetry, that don't have security agents, that oftentimes organizations have less visibility into them, right? So that, first of all, allows the attack to happen, and second, makes it much, much more harder for the organization to respond to that, to do the proper type of forensics, to understand what actually happened, to bring those devices back to the safe state. And also the fact that those devices are harder to patch in the first place, right? So, everybody is very well used to Patch Tuesdays these days, or whatever operating system you have that will have their own vulnerability management program. Those things are mostly automated in large IT enterprises these days, right? Like every month there is an update cycle. Your computer often even reboots automatically when you're not working, and then you go to work the next morning and everything is safe and secure and all that. That's very different when we're talking about those other types of devices, right? There's no automated patch in many cases. It's a much more manual process. You think of networks that have hundreds or thousands of routers and switches. Maybe 999 of those routers and switches were updated, but there's one that the patch for whatever reason didn't apply, right? And so that's the one that's used as an initial access. So yes, there is a very strong correlation with EDR, as we mentioned, patch management, and the fact that IT security, it's definitely not solved, but it's something that's much more understood these days, and organizations have put a lot more effort, a lot more investment into that. But we don't yet see this level of investment into protecting the other half of the network, let's put it this way.
I want to talk about the nature of these vulnerabilities a little bit, because some in the security research community have criticized the nature of the vulnerabilities being exploited, describing many of them as trivial issues that should have been caught by automated scanners during routine security testing of code bases. We are talking about flaws like unsanitized input leading to command injection, missing authorization checks that enable authentication bypasses and privilege escalation, basic buffer overflows. These are generally well understood problems that date back more than 2 decades at this point. And I wanted to get your perspective on that. Are these flaws something that manufacturers should have been able to catch easily? Why do they continue to persist in code bases after all this time? And does this point to shortcomings in secure development life cycles?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, right? So the reality is that yes, those vulnerabilities, those classes of vulnerabilities have been known and understood for decades. There are automated tools, static analyzers and even dynamic testing and so on that should be able to catch some of those, if not all, most of those, let's say. And we do see there is kind of a correlation between the ease of exploiting vulnerability and the fact that vulnerability is being exploited, right? You mentioned, for instance, buffer overflows and so on. Those are, in some cases, a little bit harder to exploit. You have to craft a specific payload and all. But we see things like the command injections that you said and the authorization bypasses that are usually very easy. It's just a string, that you send on an HTTP request, and those get exploited massively. The reality is that yes, it's frustrating as a network defender. Let's say it's frustrating as somebody in the security community to see that those issues still plague like security products or networking products or basically things that people depend on to have their business running. And I do think that there has been an improvement in many vendors, at least most of the major vendors, into updating their security programs, making sure that they have testing in place, making sure that they have responses to vulnerabilities and so on. It's a fact that vulnerabilities continue to happen, right? And I don't expect that we reach a point where they will not happen. I think what is important is that organizations are responding faster to those. What is alarming is, as you mentioned in the beginning, the trend of 0 days, right? 0 days are really becoming a huge problem because, they're exploited without the patch being available. They're exploited without the vendor knowing about the vulnerability, right? So indeed, I do think that there needs to be more investment and more effort into catching those things as early as possible and making sure that attackers are not the one finding them, or making sure that at least, if not internal security teams, at least external security researchers via bug bounties or something like that can help to secure those products, right? It's from my point of view, the really riskiest part of what we're discussing here now is the 0 days on network devices, and the fact that they, in many cases, continue to be easy to find and easy to exploit vulnerabilities.
Do you think this is also a case of inherited security debt? Because many of these companies are not necessarily the original developers of these products, right? They acquire them along with their parent companies originally, and maybe many of those original developers have left the company, have not necessarily made the transition, right? And now you have newer development teams taking care of these products. And one argument I've heard is that there is some reluctance from developers to go into old parts of code they don't completely understand, and there's no one around to explain it to them because those people are long gone, and go and make changes. So the burden of proof for maybe a finding by a security scanner, which might be like an insecure function, this might be potentially a vulnerability, but you have to show it to me that you can actually exploit it, that code path can be reached by a potential attacker before I go in and start changing things and make things worse or break some feature or something like that, right? Do you think there's also something like that going on? And also, we know that re-engineering legacy code bases is a big investment, right? It requires many man hours, development resources. It's a long time project. So of course those resources could maybe better be used from their perspective, those companies' perspective, to develop new features. So do you think there's some of that going on there?
No, absolutely. That's a relevant factor. So the reality is that code bases are messy nowadays, right? We've been dealing with software technology networking for, over 30 years now, right? The internet really became popular in the 90s, let's say, right? So at least 30 years of these code bases being around. There is, what you mentioned, companies being acquired. There are developers leaving. There are open source projects. There are commercial projects that are included libraries, and then the maintainers are no longer available, and things are kind of left there integrated into a code base, but nobody really owns the responsibility for that. Code bases are messy, and as you mentioned, we discussed before about static analyzers and things like that being used in secure development life cycles. They are being used, but indeed, you get you run that on a fairly large code base, you get thousands and thousands of alerts, right? And which one of those are real true positives versus false positives, what to prioritize, what to fix. As you said, go and maybe fix it, but then you create new issues. We see that's another point, by the way. We see a lot of vulnerabilities that are kind of partly fixed nowadays, but they lead to other vulnerabilities, right? You kind of close, let's put it this way, one way of reaching a vulnerable code piece of code, but then you open up another way. That has happened a lot. There was actually a statistic, I don't remember the right statistic now, but Google's project Zero Day found that something like half of the vulnerabilities that they had found in a specific year, I think a couple of years ago, were related to incomplete fixes of vulnerabilities, right? So that's also something that's going on. So just to summarize, like I said, code bases are really messy and difficult to handle, difficult to manage, but that will become more and more problematic as they grow and as technology evolves and as more and more products get, as you said, acquired, get integrated, get developed, new features appear, and so on. So complexity is not going down. Code bases are not becoming smaller any time in the future. So we do need to probably look at new ways to manage this complexity in a way.
So finally, on this topic, what do you think customers can do to mitigate this threat? It's not easy to put compensating controls like IP filtering on devices that are supposed to accept external connections from roaming employees who could be at coffee shops, airports, and that on. So on. These devices are meant to be the controls themselves. Have you observed customers maybe shifting towards their attention towards maybe SASE type offerings where these functions are handled in the cloud through global CDN networks with those service providers being responsible for patching and securing their services rather than the customer, and the customer only needs to come and configure their own access policies and that sort of thing? Is that a shift that you see companies doing instead of deploying all of these appliances and hardware devices that are hard to manage and hard to patch and so on?
So that's a great question. So yes, there is a reevaluation of secure access and VPN technologies and things like that going on in the industry, and a lot of people are adopting SASE technologies and going to other types of solutions. Let's say there was a guideline set by CISA also maybe last year, a couple of years ago, that was talking. It was not a guideline actually. It was just discussing exactly like alternatives to traditional VPNs for organizations to look into and so on. I don't think that every organization will move there. I don't think that solves all the problems. That solves some problems, but introduces others. There might be vulnerabilities on the SASE providers as well, and so on. I do think that there are things that organizations can still do to harden their own internal devices, appliances, even if they are exposed online, right? So, for instance, you might expose the services that need to be exposed, but not the management interfaces. Let's say if it's a router, right, you don't necessarily need the whole management interface of the router to be exposed directly online. Maybe that can only be accessed from the internal network, or maybe that can be accessed via a VPN. There are ways to think of how to control access. You don't need to think of a device and full access into those devices externally, right? There are other solutions like multi-factor authentication that help to mitigate some of those attacks. There is logging on those devices that can be enabled, can be enriched, can be sent to the SIEM, and can be used for threat detection. There are a lot of things that can be done to reduce risk, making sure that the networks that are connected to those devices are well segmented in a way that even if you do get access to a device like that, you don't necessarily have access to the whole entire network of an organization and so on. So I would say that there are two ways of looking at this, right? One is, yes, consider if it makes sense for your business, for your organization to transition from a traditional VPN, traditional networking deployment to something different. There are advantages, there are disadvantages for that. It's on each individual business to look into that and weigh those pros and cons and decide what to do. But even if you decide to stay with the traditional appliances, traditional devices, traditional equipment, there are ways to look into hardening those, to look into having the right level of visibility into those and the right level of network segmentation that you reduce your risk to a level that might be more acceptable.
Well, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with me and share your insights into these complex issues that companies have to deal with in the world of cybersecurity.
All right, so that was a great interview, and we're going to bring Lucian on to discuss this in a second. But first, are you ready to take on the future of cyber resilience? On November 19th, Commvault's Shift Virtual brings you dynamic keynotes, breakthrough product innovation, and live Q&A with the experts. It's your chance to stay ahead of the threats shaping tomorrow. You'll join global leaders and innovators with live captions in more than 15 languages wherever you are. Don't just keep up, lead. Register now for Commvault's Shift Virtual. All right, we're back, and we're going to bring in Lucian Constantine. He is a senior writer at CSO Online. Hello, Lucian.
Hi, Kit. Hi, Matt.
Hey,
So Lucian, what was your biggest takeaway from that interview with Daniel? Because you raised a lot of interesting angles and perspectives. So what was the thing that stood out most from your perspective?
Well, the most important thing, I guess, the companies need to give more importance to these devices in their patch management and integrate them, pull the logs from them into their CM products and monitor them for suspicious activity and make sure they're timely patched. When it comes to zero-day vulnerabilities, as you said, these are vulnerabilities that are previously unknown and are getting exploited, so there is no patch available. But there are a lot of things that you can do in order to detect potential intrusions through these vulnerabilities. So it's not just about prevention, the patching thing. It's also about the response. It's doing threat hunting, scanning these logs for suspicious activities, and so on. I guess that's the takeaway here, and from the overall trend that we've been seeing for the past 3 years, but especially last year and this year, where it really accelerated. And these are targets for mostly state-sponsored APT groups, what we call advanced persistent threats. Usually cyber espionage groups, if I'm being honest. And what they look for is stealthy, persistent access into enterprise networks. And from there, they can do lateral movement and start their espionage goals, which is, collecting files, collecting IP, collecting everything they need to steal, right?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out for me when I was watching the interview was that that a lot of these devices, such as the firewalls, the VPN appliances, even IP cameras, are a lot harder to patch than maybe some of these endpoint workstations, laptops that you see out there. And I chuckled a little because we've done such a good job with Patch Tuesday and some of these patch management applications that now, now that the attackers are like, well, they're doing such a good job with that, let's go somewhere else, and they're finding some of these other devices. It reminded me of that old saying about, well, why do you rob banks? And someone's like, well, that's where the money is. And in the same thing, it's like, well, why are you attacking these now? It's because that's where the holes are. So, we've done a good job patching on one side, but then the other part of the network is now out. Matt, any other thoughts from you on your reactions to the interview?
yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I found it fascinating because I wasn't fully aware of the situation, given the stats that you read out at the start there, Keith, and then trying to understand the why, as we said earlier. I mean, some of the things that I found really fascinating. I mean, Lucian, presumably, it's fair to say, and this is something that resonates with the IT leaders that I speak to, like, one of the challenges here is literally understanding how many devices you have, understanding your legacy code base or your legacy infrastructure, because actually for a lot of organizations that kind of real basic but deep kind of knowledge might not be at your fingertips, right?
Right. I would say this is kind of like the new low-hanging fruit, right, for attackers, because over the past decade or even more, the security industry has focused a lot on protecting the endpoint. So the endpoint now has like Windows, pulls out, you have CM products that pull out logs from Windows, you have EDR products. Windows itself has become much more hardened than it used to be back in the day at the kernel level, at the user level. So while there still are vulnerabilities, in Windows that are getting exploited sometimes. There's also a fast response with the Patch Tuesday and patch deployment for Windows. I remember there was a SharePoint, I think one of the vulnerability intelligence companies shared with me, there was a SharePoint vulnerability exploited, and in a matter of hours after the patch came out, 67% of enterprises or more had adopted the patch. Whereas for these network edge devices, the time is more in the range of days, months, even, because the process is different, right? And it shouldn't necessarily be different. But these devices have been considered black boxes for a long time for both the enterprises and enterprise admins, but also for the attackers. They are embedded devices. They have unusual tool sets. While many of them run Linux, it's a very it has restricted tools. It has restricted commands available. The file system is encrypted. So while researchers have found vulnerabilities in these devices for over a decade now, it was more of a research endeavor. You didn't often see attacks targeting these devices because finding a 0-day in these devices is not necessarily easy. But also from a development perspective, they don't have the same code maturity as Windows has, for example. So you still find bugs that some security researchers call 90s eras vulnerabilities, like simple buffer overflows, which is an insecure code function that someone wrote, and things that they argue automated tools should catch. So it's not only from a user perspective a problem of monitoring these devices, it's also from a vendor perspective a problem, because it seems the entire industry, the manufacturers of these devices, are all affected. And the question is, is this a secure development lifecycle problem? Why are they not using secure coding practices? And there's a lot of discussion right there as well, because rewriting legacy code is a big investment monetarily. And if there's not a request in the market for it, if that's not your differentiator in the market, but new features, then some companies, some vendors might not make that investment in going back and rewriting code that was written 10 years ago by developers who are no longer with the company.
Yeah. That's another thing that stood out during your interview, Lucian, was the frustration over that code-based complexity. Not only is that code getting more and more complex, but that inherited security debt. And I found it fascinating that a lot of security team members don't want to go into the code that might be 10, 15 years old if the original developers are no longer there, because it felt like they were saying that, well, if we tried to fix it, that could open up additional vulnerabilities or break things even. And so I think that's just part of the tech debt problem that I think a lot of companies are facing.
It's more of the developers don't want to go there, or the burden of proof is higher, right? Because so the security teams, what they do, they are supposed to find the vulnerabilities. So they run automated scanners, static analysis, dynamic analysis, even manual code reviews, right? And you might run a scanner and find whatever potential buffer overflows, and you give this to the development team, hey, fix it. And if it's in code that's not very well understood and written long ago by someone who's no longer around with the company, a developer might say, no, you have to actually show me how an attacker can reach this vulnerable function in the code. Is there an attack path to it? Because if we go and make changes, and we might break something, and then causes more development hours and so on. I mean, this is something that was shared with me by research, not necessarily my personal opinion, but this kind of things do exist, right?
Yeah, Matt, anything else that stood out with the interview with Daniel?
Well, a couple of things really. I was just going to ask a question off the back of that. Like, does that mean that organizations, to a certain extent, have to accept a certain level of risk, would you say? Like, do they have to decide how comfortable they are with managing risk with legacy devices, do you think?
you're talking about users of the enterprises, not manufacturers, not the manufacturers of
Yeah,
these
yeah.
devices.
So the enterprises themselves, right? This will be an issue for pretty much any organization. So they sort of, but to your point, it's probably not possible to completely resolve it. So do they have to decide what level of risk they're happy to take versus what amount of investment they want to put into potentially finding and solving problems?
Yes, but that also applies to anything, really, because security is not the practice of eliminating risk. It's the practice of managing risk. So if any piece of software will have vulnerabilities. Obviously, there are differences. The more you invest in secure coding practices, secure development lifecycle, that sort of thing, rewriting code regularly, going back, running fuzzers, all of these tools, the fewer vulnerabilities you'll have, but there's no guarantee you won't have any vulnerabilities. I mean, even Windows, after all these years of patching, obviously it's a huge code base, still gets a lot of vulnerabilities and buffer overflows. And then there is anti-exploitation things that you can do on top of that at the kernel level. So even if you find one of these flows, you have to chain it with other flows. And if you even these exploits on network edge devices, usually it's like two vulnerabilities combined. So it's kind of like an attack chain. It's not a single exploit. It's a command injection combined with a privilege escalation or buffer overflow to execute code on the operating system. So the goal is for the developers to make these attack chains as complex as possible, so the attackers the return on investment is But also when you're dealing with nation state attackers, these are groups that have a lot of resources and time and interest, right? It's not your average cyber criminal. These are usually.
Well, the other question I was going to ask then, does AI change this? Because, we understand how AI can help secure things, but again, with unlimited resources and the ability to apply an AI technology to finding these potential, multiple secondary infections, let's say, flaw with another flaw that can be done. Like, does that change the game again as well in terms of it's easier to find vulnerabilities, presumably?
Sure. I'll go back a little bit to your question because I think I kind of deviated and didn't answer. Companies do have, they could choose to use other technologies. That's like SASE, which is Secure Access Service Edge, which means many of these features that this like the zero trust network access that VPN gateways maybe are doing. This now exist in the cloud, right? Like through CDN networks, through distributed networks around the world, and this is as a service. And in that case, you kind of the management is done by the service provider. So it's no longer up to your admins to go and patch the device and all that, because it's their service. They are doing. As an organization, you are just in charge of setting the policies, who has access where and when they connect and what's being checked, and two-factor multi-factor authentication and device fingerprinting and all those things. But this means that you no longer necessarily have to have 10 of these devices in every office, so you can support remote employees logging in remotely. So these hardware appliances, VPN gateways, or firewalls at the network edge. So there's that option, and some companies might go for that. That comes with other challenges. You're now depending on a cloud service. What happens when the internet goes down? Those types of things. So it's always you have to balance those things out. But also companies have paid for these devices, so they have, as long as they are still under support, they're probably going to make use of them, not buy something else because of budgetary constraints and stuff. As for AI,
wait, Lucian, That's part of our bonus footage. I was just going to mention that we have bonus footage with Lucian in the interview. Additional discussions, including the impact of AI on vulnerability research, as well as more discussions around patch management solutions and the growth of zero-day and one-day attacks. So we're going to actually put that out in a couple of weeks as sort of our bonus DVD coverage of this episode. So we are out of time, unfortunately. So Lucian and Matt, again, thanks for being on the show to talk about the latest in cybersecurity.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you to everyone who joined the show today. If you liked this episode, be sure to give us a like on YouTube, add any comments, and check out our other Tech Talk shows, such as Today in Tech, CIO Leadership Live, First Person, and Demo if you are looking for the latest product demonstrations. I'm Keith Shaw. Thanks for watching, and thank you to Commvault for sponsoring this episode.